Those Days with the Monsters, Part 61. It was a long run before Kirrel started to even think about slowing down, and still longer before he came to a halt, forced to it by his overheating muscles. The child in his grip flailed 2 free arms, striking at his neck ineffectually.
Bad thing! Mama! Take me back to Mama!
She wriggled around and tried to bite his arm. Kirrel pulled it away hastily. She was small, but her mandibles were probably very sharp, and he didn't need a wound right now.
It's okay, I'll take you back when I can.
Kirrel was lying, and he felt a bit sick doing it, but what was he supposed to tell her? He probably couldn't even remember the way back to her mother, much less find a way around the Tizzicks who had probably killed her. Taking this child back was an empty promise. The child continued to whimper and call for her mother, along with trying to bite him. While it wasn't exactly difficult to keep his appendages out of her small mandibles, every time she couldn't bite him, she seemed to be getting a little bit louder, given how very badly Kirrel wanted to avoid being found. Having a steadily increasing source of sound in his arms was worrying.
Hey, it's okay. Listen to me, it's going to be okay, see? You're okay.
Kirrel realised with a sinking heart that she had no translator. There was no way he could make the multitude of buzzing and rattling sounds that seemed to make up Tizzic's speech, and she was almost certainly too young to speak Galactic Standard, if Tizzic's even could. He had to calm her. He had to communicate with her, and she couldn't understand him.
What do I do? What in stars' names do I do?
Hesitantly, Kirrel tried to tap her back, like he would an elam child. It didn't seem to be having the desired effect. If anything, she appeared to be getting louder. Kirrel's heart leaped in panic, his frills turning red.
Shh. It's okay, calm down. Please calm down. Ow!
Kirrel spared the time to look at his arm, where the child's mandibles had managed to catch a bit of his hide. The injury didn't appear to be bleeding, but it certainly stung. From somewhere nearby, Kirrel heard the repeating triple beat of Tizzic's footsteps, as well as quiet muttering.
Time's running out.
In something of a panic, Kirrel reached out and patted the back of her head, just at the start of her bony protective plates, hoping vaguely that it would do something helpful. To his astonishment, her shrieks began to subside into whimpers, then into quiet hisses as her throat sac inflated and deflated.
Are you okay now?
She looked up at him, tilting her head slightly. She couldn't understand. Of course she couldn't understand. Kirrel couldn't help but notice that, where most Tizzicks had a hard bony shell around their head and neck, her plates were soft and almost leathery.
They must harden as they get older.
With a chill, he realised how fragile this little creature in his arms was. She couldn't break his skin with her mandibles. With her size, she probably couldn't even open a door yet. Kirrel tried, but he couldn't imagine a scenario in which she could survive this city on her own.
Then she can't be alone.
That was all there was to it. She had to come with him.
Not that a panicked cargo jockey will give her much chance.
Kirrel's frills flushed blue for this child, who probably wouldn't even understand why when the two of them died. Something in Kirrel's head snapped. His frills flared in an instant with a little pop sound that made the child in his arms jump.
No, never.
She couldn't understand him. If they died on this planet, no. When they died on this planet, she wouldn't understand his explanation. His comfort might as well just be noise. This tiny little child would essentially die alone.
No, not alone. Never alone.
Kirrel had to maneuver around his flared frills, but he reached up to his acoustic canal and pulled his translator free. Their shouts in the distance broke apart into clicks, rattles and hisses immediately. It didn't matter. He didn't have to hear. The only thing he needed was to keep this child from dying alone. The department had given him a new translator when he joined as liaison. Kirrel hoped it was adaptive. He knew that adaptive translators were fairly high-end, and after all, they hadn't even given him a hazmat suit. But the translator, it had to be adaptive. He couldn't think of any other way to explain how he felt. It simply had to be. With a rushing heartbeat buzzing in his ears, Kirrel fiddled with the translator and hooked it to where he thought a Tizzic's auditory area would be.
Can you hear me?
No answer. He adjusted the translator's position. locating a small hole near the back of the first bony plate, and tried again.
Can you hear me?
To his surprise and alarm, the child in his arms immediately burst into a racket of rattles and buzzing sounds.
Okay, calm down.
It took a few tries, but the child in his arms quietened. Kirrel cleared his throat, the spines on his frills pulsing yellow.
Okay, I gave you my translator so you could understand me, but that means I can't understand you very well. So, we'll have to figure something out.
A quick pulse of embarrassed purple stained Kirrel's frills as he realised he'd missed a crucial part of getting to know someone.
What's your name?
There was no way for Kirrel to describe the serial clicking buzz that followed. Equally, there was no way for his vocal box to make that set of sounds.
Sorry, can you say that again?
After a few tries, Kirrel thought he could perhaps approximate the sounds with Galactic Standard.
Nurixa?
His attempt was met with a violent rattling sound that made Kirrel deeply wish he still had his translator. The approximation was probably offensively wrong. The thought stained his frills a deep, embarrassed purple.
I got it wrong, didn't I?
The child burst into another racket of clicks and hisses. This wasn't working very well.
This is going to have to be like a game of yes-no, isn't it?
He hadn't had anyone to play yes-no with on Richthen, but he'd watched the Clutch play the game. The rules were a lot like this situation, where he could only ask questions, and she could only respond with yes or no. It could really work. Even so, it could only work if she could actually tell him yes or no. Kirrel racked his brain, trying to think of a sound that she could make that he could first explain and then identify later. The steady thump, thump, thump of Atizik's footsteps interrupted Kirrel's racing thoughts. He could communicate with her later. For now he had to either hide or run, and his body temperature was still extremely high. He'd outmaneuvered Tizix under prime conditions, but in this situation, already overheated, there was no chance. The only option was to hide.
We're going to have to be very quiet for a bit, okay?
Kirrel's head swiveled quickly. He could see teal and yellow on most of the buildings around.
Not there, not there, and absolutely not there.
There were few places to hide, and the more he looked, the fewer of them seemed safe. They were out of time. Kirrel ducked behind a broken wall that still had a very weak glimmer, upwind of most of the grey fog coming off the rubble. He tried to stop panting, fanning his frills in an effort to reduce sound. Thump thump thump, thump thump thump. Their steps were getting closer. Kirrel swallowed hard, hoping Nurixa would be quiet. He didn't know if she understood the seriousness of the situation. He didn't even know if the situation was serious. But he wasn't willing to gamble. The Tizix approaching them could be anyone. They could have any intentions at all, any motives. They could be slow enough for an overheated Elam to outpace, or they could catch him in an instant, and given everything he'd seen so far, Kirrel was inclined to assume the worst of all possible options. Thump thump thump, thump thump thump, thump thump. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the wall. Kirrel held his breath, holding Nurixa close to his centre of mass. If that Tizix came over the wall, he needed to be well balanced. There would be no time for a wobble. Behind the wall, the Tizix clicked quietly. Nurix's throat sac inflated abruptly with a sharp hiss. Kirrel flinched, his heart pounding against his ribs. A spectral silence hung in the air along with the grey fog. Kirrel was never sure what warned him. Maybe the rubble of the wall shifting. Maybe there was a whisper of air. He felt the shadow of Alex's hand flashing out to strike him, but it was larger, sharper. There was no time. Kirrel landed twice his length from the wall, already turning to face it, holding Nurixa close to his chest. The Tizix was now halfway over the rubble, standing frozen with one appendage where Kirrel and Nurixa had been before. Nurixa made a small rattling noise that Kirrel didn't understand, but she curled closer into him. That body language was hard to mistake.
You're scared. Me too, child.
The Tizix came over the wall, lunging forward with a rasping hiss. Kirrel took a step backwards, eyes fixed on the charging mass. The rubble underfoot slid out from under him. The sky tilted forward until it was in front of his face, and his back hit the ground. Nurixa let out a screech as she smacked into his ribcage, and then the starlight vanished, blotted out by a dark Tizix face. Without thinking, Kirrel raised his legs, as if a Tizzix could be stopped like Alex's metal hand. A sharp impact and a heavy weight struck his foot, and he groaned, but the Tizzix mandibles stopped an inch from his face. His legs felt wet. Rixa was screaming. It took Kirrel a moment before understanding, and nausea washed over him in awful waves. One of his rear claws was buried in the Tizzix's chest, in a chink between its plates. Green dripped down his leg. The Tizzix didn't seem to have noticed. It was still clacking and hissing, pushing itself further onto his claws. The awful screaming went on. Kirrel pushed up a bit and looked at Rixa, covered in green blood.
Oh, stars. It's okay, don't look. Just close your eyes. It's okay.
Amazingly, Rixa closed her 7 small eyes, still covered in blood. Kirrel's heart pounded, but he couldn't seem to think.
He was gone immediately.
The echo of the medic from his muddled first moments drifted through Kirrel's head.
Clearly not this time.
He should be fighting or clawing or doing something, but he couldn't seem to think, couldn't seem to move. All he could do was hold still, hold this Tizzix away while blood dripped on his legs and Rixa screamed. He couldn't even look away from the awful wound as it slowly deepened with pressure. It felt like hours had passed when the weight of the Tizzix above suddenly increased. Kirrel grunted, trying to support it, but the weight was too much. Glittering black mandibles clacked against the side of his face, but they didn't tear his flesh. In fact, they didn't move at all. Kirrel glanced up from his leg. The Tizzix's eyes were rolled downward horribly. A strange, strangled, choking noise came from its mouth. His stomach roiled. The eyes, empty, blank eyes. He tried to push his foot away from the wound. The claw buried in it tugged on. Something inside. Kirrel stopped moving entirely. He might have stopped breathing. The only thing that hadn't stopped seemed to be his stomach. Rixa stirred in his arms, and Kirrel remembered his position. He had to find a place to hide with Rixa. She probably already needed to eat. Children generally had higher metabolic requirements than adults, regardless of the species. At least he knew that. Besides, he had to get the blood off her. She couldn't open her eyes and see herself covered in green. He could think about what had happened later. Rixa came first. Thanks for listening. It's nice to be back.